The Ottoman Trap and the Gallipoli Catastrophe. By 1915, the war was supposed to be ending. The blockade had been in place for months. The Western Front was locked in stalemate. Casualties were rising faster than victories. Something had to change. According to Prolonging the Agony, this was the moment when strategy began to chase illusion. If the war could not be won directly, it would be won indirectly. The answer, policymakers believed, lay not in France or Belgium, but thousands of miles away in the collapsing Ottoman Empire. Break the Ottomans, open the straits, bring Russia relief, end the war in one decisive stroke. On paper it looked elegant, in practice it would become one of the most catastrophic failures of the entire conflict. Gallipoli was not an accident of war, it was a gamble born of desperation and shaped by assumptions that no longer held. This episode examines how a war that refused to end pushed decision-makers toward increasingly reckless solutions, and how the attempt to force a shortcut through the Ottoman Empire only deepened the disaster. Chapter 6. The Ottoman Enigma. Saving Constantinople. Chapter 6 examines the hidden struggle over Constantinople and the Bosphorus, which the authors argue lay at the heart of Russia's commitment to the war. Russia entered the conflict believing that victory would finally deliver what it had sought for centuries: control over Constantinople and secure access to warm water ports. At the same time, Britain, France, and Germany all had competing interests in the weakening Ottoman Empire. Internal instability intensified after the rise of the Young Turks, who seized power through coups in 1908 and 1913. While they pursued modernization with foreign assistance, the long-term plans of the European powers depended on the Ottoman Empire being defeated and dismantled, not preserved. Despite seeking alignment with the Entente, the Young Turks were rejected. Matters escalated when Britain abruptly seized two modern battleships that had been built for the Turkish Navy, an action that humiliated Turkey and pleased Russia. Within days, Turkey signed a secret alliance with Germany, though it remained officially neutral. The chapter highlights a remarkable naval episode. After Britain stripped Turkey of its new ships, the Royal Navy allowed German warships, the Goeben and Breslau, to escape pursuit and reach Constantinople. Once there, Germany transferred them to the Turkish Navy, instantly restoring Ottoman naval power. According to the authors, this carefully managed sequence of events served a strategic purpose: to prevent Russia from seizing Constantinople outright. By ensuring the Bosphorus remained defended, Britain preserved its leverage over both allies and rivals alike. The chapter concludes that Ottoman entry into the war was not accidental but engineered through deception and strategic manipulation, all to control access to one of the most critical gateways in global geopolitics, as well as to keep Russia in the war. Chapter 6 suggests that the Ottoman War was less about alliance and more about controlling who would and who would not inherit Constantinople and other remnants of the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 7. The Ottoman Enigma. Neutral till it suits. Chapter 7 argues that Ottoman neutrality was carefully managed rather than genuine, shaped by British strategy and diplomatic deception. Britain's ambassador in Constantinople, Louis Millet, is portrayed as a key figure working closely with elite power networks to keep Turkey neutral only for as long as it suited British interests. Britain's priority was twofold: keep Russia committed to the war while avoiding unrest across the wider Muslim world. To achieve this, British officials engaged in a prolonged game of promises and delays with the Young Turk leadership. Winston Churchill maintained direct contact with Enver Pasha, one of the most influential figures in the Ottoman government, as both sides maneuvered for time and advantage. The turning point came in late October 1914. After receiving a substantial gold payment from Germany, Enver Pasha authorized Ottoman naval attacks on Russian ports in the Black Sea. By then, Britain had already positioned its forces in the Middle East, launched propaganda campaigns about protecting Islamic holy sites, and quietly encouraged Arab opposition to Ottoman rule. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire on November 2nd, followed shortly by Britain and France. The chapter concludes that Ottoman entry into the war was not a sudden betrayal or accident, but the result of deliberate diplomatic manipulation. Neutrality maintained only until it no longer served the strategic designs of the great powers. Chapter 7 suggests that neutrality wasn't abandoned, it was spent. Chapter 8, The Dardanelles, the Russian Dream. Chapter 8 examines how the Dardanelles campaign was driven by illusion rather than alliance. As Russian losses mounted on the Eastern Front, enthusiasm for the war began to drain away. What sustained Russia's commitment was a long-standing ambition, control of Constantinople and the Straits, giving Russia year-round access to the Mediterranean. Publicly, Britain and France appeared to support these ambitions. Privately, the authors argue, neither power intended to allow Russia to claim Constantinople. France sought Syria, Britain sought Persia and strategic control along the route to India. Russian Foreign Secretary Sergei Sazonov increasingly doubted Allied sincerity, and resentment grew in Petrograd that Russia was carrying a disproportionate share of the war. To keep Russia fighting while quietly blocking its objectives, British planners crafted a deception. The appearance of support for a strike against Turkey was meant to reassure Russia without granting it real control. On December 26, 1914, Maurice Hankey produced a memorandum proposing an operation against the Dardanelles, an idea designed more to sustain Russian morale than to deliver Russian victory. British diplomats reinforced the illusion. In Petrograd, the British military attaché subtly encouraged Russian leaders to request Allied action against Turkey. The request was then framed as a plea to relieve pressure on Russian forces in the Caucasus. Winston Churchill seized on the proposal and pushed for a naval assault on the Dardanelles, despite the near-unanimous opposition of senior naval commanders, who suggested the plan was reckless and impracticable. The chapter suggests that the campaign was less a strategic necessity than a political performance, aimed at keeping Russia in the war while ensuring Constantinople remained out of its reach. Chapter 8 argues that the Dardanelles were not a gift to Russia, but a carefully staged promise never meant to be fulfilled. Chapter 9, The Dardanelles, Impossible Quest. Chapter 9 presents the Dardanelles campaign as being an operation designed to appear serious while being structurally doomed. The authors argue it began not as a viable military plan, but as a demonstration meant to convince Russia that Britain was attempting to capture the Straits and Constantinople on its behalf. To legitimize the scheme, Winston Churchill sought naval approval and fastened on to the cautious support of Sackville-Carden, bypassing more experienced senior commanders. What followed was the sudden emergence of the so-called Carden Plan, unveiled at a War Council meeting in July 1915. Herbert Kitchener refused to commit the army to what he regarded as a futile naval fantasy. The fleet assembled for the assault reflected this lack of seriousness. With the exception of one modern dreadnought, the ships sent to the Mediterranean were slow, outdated, and unfit for modern combat. Early bombardments achieved little, while storms and heavy Turkish defenses stalled progress. The straits were protected by hundreds of guns and defense minefields, yet minesweeping was assigned to converted fishing trawlers crewed by civilians with no training for such work. Even Russian observers recognized that a naval attack alone was meaningless. Eventually, ground forces were reluctantly committed, including British, French, and Anzac troops. When the main assault began in March 1915, the outcome was predictable. Multiple battleships were sunk or crippled with heavy loss of life. According to the authors, the failure surprised no one in real authority. Maurice Hankey was later compared the operation to a theatrical performance where each step was publicly announced in advance. The chapter concludes that the Dardanelles campaign was less a military blunder than an impossible quest pursued for political appearances rather than victory. Furthermore, to note is that the attack on the Dardanelles was launched in two phases, a naval attack and then a land attack, which alerted the Turks to what was going to come and allowed them ample time to defend themselves. If it had been a serious attack, they would have launched the naval attack right before a land attack, and it would have been a complete surprise. Instead, there was no surprise, and thus the troops that landed were slaughtered. Chapter 9 argues the Dardanelles were never meant to succeed, only to be seen. Chapter 10 Gallipoli, Prepare to Fail. Chapter 10 presents Gallipoli not as a strategic miscalculation, but as a campaign doomed by incompetence, secrecy, failures, and deliberate neglect. Planning was chaotic or non-existent, and the quality of leadership at the highest levels was disastrously poor. The Allied commander, General Ian Hamilton, was sent into the operation almost completely blind. He had no reliable intelligence on the terrain, enemy strength, supply routes, or even his own command structure. Military intelligence provided little more than tourist guidebooks, while key departments actively withheld up-to-date information. Meanwhile, the Turks, assisted by capable German officers, used the long delays to fortify every possible landing site with trenches, wire, and artillery. Secrecy collapsed entirely. The Egyptian press openly reported the arrival of Allied forces and their intended destination. A 65-day delay between the first naval attack and the landings allowed Ottoman defenses to become nearly impregnable. What might have succeeded as a rapid, coordinated strike earlier in the year became impossible by the time troops finally landed in April 1915. Leadership decisions compounded the disaster. A competent divisional commander was inexplicably replaced with a widely ridiculed general, further undermining the operation. By the time Allied forces came ashore, they faced a heavily reinforced enemy, well prepared and well led. The chapter concludes that Gallipoli was not merely badly executed, it was prepared to fail, turning the campaign into a public and predictable horror that cost tens of thousands of lives for no strategic gain. Chapter 10 argues that Gallipoli failed not through bad luck, but through neglect, delay, and leadership that made failure inevitable. Chapter 11 Gallipoli, What Did They Care? Chapter 11 confronts the human cost of indifference at the highest levels of power. As the Gallipoli landings approached, General Hamilton warned Herbert Kitchener that his commanders believed a successful assault was impossible. Their fears proved correct. The landings became immediate slaughter, with casualties so severe that hospital ships were quickly overwhelmed. Of roughly 30,000 men landed in the early stages, around 20,000 became casualties. Despite this carnage, support was withdrawn rather than reinforced. The Admiralty refused to commit fully to a joint naval and land operation and ordered Britain's most powerful battleship home to avoid risk, leaving troops exposed on shore. Meanwhile, in London, political consequences followed failure, not foresight. The Liberal government under H. Herbert Asquith collapsed into a coalition. Winston Churchill was dismissed, replaced by Arthur Balfour, but the strategy itself remained unchanged. Throughout the summer of 1915, conditions on the peninsula deteriorated into horror. Heat, flies, disease, thirst, and medical neglect turned Gallipoli into an army of sick as much as the wounded. Yet even then another offensive was lost in August, producing even higher casualties with no strategic gain. Many deaths, especially from dehydration, were never properly recorded. The chapter's conclusion is stark. The suffering at Gallipoli continued not because it had to, but because those directing the war were insulated from its consequences. Furthermore, in another sense, the Gallipoli mission was a success. For Russian onlookers watching the carnage and the amount of British casualties were indeed convinced that Britain was on their side and would fight for the Russian interests in the war. Hence, an ally was assuaged and kept in the war. Chapter 12. Gallipoli, the cover-up. Chapter 12 argues that Gallipoli ended not with accountability but with a carefully managed cover-up. Thousands of Australian and New Zealand troops were left sick, wounded, and abandoned in a campaign that had achieved nothing. Yet rather than confront the truth, British leadership moved quickly to control the narrative. Maurice Hankey was sent to Gallipoli to report directly to the Prime Minister. General Ian Hamilton believed the visit would vindicate his command, but instead he was quietly positioned as the fall guy. At the same time, Russian observers witnessed the August offensives and interpreted the staggering losses as proof that Britain and France were genuinely fighting on Russia's behalf. The deception worked. Russia remained committed to the war. Behind the scenes, blame was being carefully assigned. An Australian journalist, Keith Murdoch, gathered eyewitness accounts under the pretense of investigating logistical failures. His report, which exposed the scale of disaster, made its way to London and was read by figures closely tied to the British elite. Murdoch was called before the cabinet, and consensus was reached that the campaign must end, but without exposing those who had engineered it. The troops were withdrawn, and responsibility was placed squarely on Hamilton and a handful of commanders, particularly Vice Admiral Sackville Carden. A formal Dardanelles commission was established, but its findings were delayed until after the war and ultimately whitewashed the true decision-makers. The chapter concludes that revealing the full truth would have shattered public faith and endangered the British Empire itself. Instead, Gallipoli was transformed into legend. The mythology of heroic sacrifice endured, especially in Australia and New Zealand, while the campaign's true promise and deliberate mismanagement were buried beneath official history. Gallipoli is often remembered as a tragic miscalculation, a failure of planning, a failure of execution, a failure of leadership. Prolonging the Agony asks us to look deeper. According to the book, Gallipoli was not an isolated blunder. It was a symptom of a war that had reached a strategic dead end, a symptom of systems that could sustain conflict but not conclude it, a symptom of decision-making driven by pressure to change the appearance of momentum rather than the reality. When the war could not be ended directly, it was rerouted. The Ottoman Empire became the testing ground for that rerouting, a peripheral theater, chosen not because it was decisive, but because it was available. The result was catastrophe, tens of thousands of dead, no strategic breakthrough, no shortened war, and yet the conflict continued. Gallipoli failed, but the system that produced it did not. In fact, the system that produced it certainly came out ahead in assuring Russia that they had their back, and Russia thus continued the war. If Gallipoli shows what happens when leaders search for shortcuts, the next episode shows what happens when war becomes dependent on resources, because behind every front line lies an economy, and behind every economy lies a calculation.